One that had rebates.
Hello? Is the sound on? Way up. So we are going to wait a few more minutes as people wander in. But I would invite you to fill out, there's a survey in your chair, and that would be a big help to us. So if you would fill that out, and actually some students will be going up and down the aisles, they'd be happy to take that off your hands, or you're also welcome to leave it on the table as you go out tonight. But thank you for giving us that feedback, and I'll be up here again in a couple more minutes.
Krista, if it's an evaluation, they didn't give me much of a chance.
Western.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
I thought you mentioned it, and I was like,
Yeah, I know. It's 2 years ago we started planning.
basically related.
That's not the boss. There's other. It's on our agenda for next week.
I used to do that in elementary school. We just
Oh, yeah.
Good turnout. I was but no, this is Don't mind me.
Good evening. This time I'm actually up here for real. And we are about to start tonight. We are delighted to see you all here. I am Kristen Helwig-Hansen, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the 9th Annual UAA Undergraduate Philosophy Conference and the UAA Ethics Center Inaugural Convocation. I apologize to those of you who have sun in your eyes. What do I say? It will go away. There are a couple people that I would really like to introduce. First, on a more personal level, Roger Ames is very well known. Those of us who know him at all know that he comes with an incredible other person who makes it possible for him to travel around the world and be the scholar he is. So I wondered if we could welcome Bonnie Ames with the letter. And likewise, she used to be on the faculty here at UAA, but she is now a professor emerita. Diddy Hitchens from political science. Obviously, conferences require what seems a lot of life requires, and that is support, including financial support. And so we want to name a few and highlight a few tonight. First, we're very grateful to the Office of the Provost. He was very gracious in catching the vision and giving us that encouragement as we started this process long ago last fall. And then there are some people here that I'm going to ask to have them stand up. Today, we had the unusual pleasure of getting to just stay together for meals and travel together, really enjoying the casual hospitality time. It's really in these moments that we think about and talk more about the papers, and we make friendships, we start new collaborations. And so I would like to acknowledge the board members from the Alaska International Education Foundation Incorporated, or AIEF. You'll notice the posters around thanking them as well, but President Santa Green and board member Jerry Jenkins. And tomorrow they'll be giving you your own greetings, but I did want to acknowledge close collaboration and good friendships and really lots of help from the UAA Confucius Institute. We also tonight had help from the UAA Honors College, and in fact, Professor Ames is considered part of the research symposium, and they would focus us on the fact that Professor Ames does humanities research, as many of you could do, and they are looking for undergraduates interested in more undergraduate research. It's not just science folks that do research. So we thank the Honors College. And then it's time to give space. And for the UAA, thank you, Ed. Ed's back there telling me this mic is fading, or I'm fading. Okay, thank you, Bill. I'd like to introduce John Moricade. He's the department chairman of the philosophy department, and he will also speak on behalf of the UAA Ethics Center.
This is the 9th Undergraduate Philosophy Conference. The first one occurred the first year that I was here on faculty, first year that Ray and Stephanie and Terry were here as well. And that was initiated by our students, the first group of majors that graduated from the philosophy program. So I want to recognize and honor the students who are here and who have participated in past conferences and in this conference. This is primarily about our students. And in line with that, we have for several years now been giving out an award for the best essay submitted to the conference. And along with this certificate, you will be memorialized on a little plaque in the philosophy department and be given some more temporal award as well, the $100 check that you'll get also. And so for this year, open the envelope. The award goes to Josephine Hishon.
Okay, and now for the main attraction. Oh, excuse me. I'm so sorry.
one of our main attractions has been working with Kristen Hansen and Raymond Anthony over the past 6 months. We've been learning about Confucian ethics this past weekend, which is about relationships and building community and the fact that we all work together, but oftentimes you have leaders, people who really stand out. Kristen Hansen is one of these people with incredible vision for this conference, knowing exactly what she wanted to do, persistent in following up every detail, and those who have worked with her so far at this conference know exactly what I'm talking about. Persistence. And passion. We could definitely not have done this conference without her, and I would like to recognize Kristen and all of her efforts at this moment. Please welcome me in a round of applause. So in honor of her, Kristen, please come up. We have a bouquet for spring and joy, but also we framed a special conference poster for her, which will be better framed in time. And we have one more thank you. Dr. Raymond Anthony, off to the side there. Also, incredibly persistent, but also joyful in everything he does. And we have appreciated everything that he has done in working with Kristen and in putting this conference together. Please come forward, Dr. Anthony, so we can recognize you. I think, Kristen, you are next.
And I'm not next very long, but I asked Professor Ames today how he might like to be introduced, because if you've ever seen his CV or even any of his supposedly brief bios, well, that would take the next hour. And so I asked, he said, oh, just being professor of philosophy out of the University of Hawaii is enough. I asked him a little more, like about this. He is the 2013 Confucius Culture Prize recipient. And he said, well, it's not really getting the prize, having the prize. It was the fact that 15 scholars that I particularly admire, would even suggest that I could, that this was something, that I had done a good enough job in helping people understand Confucianism. Well, helping people understand Confucianism is really the understatement. I'll let you see for yourselves, and so it is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Roger Ames.
Thank you, Kristen. First thing that I wanted to get clear on is I'm from the University of Hawaii, and we've been missing some weather. Has anybody seen it? Somehow or other, Anchorage looks an awful lot like home. I like to use this image, Alice in Wonderland, Alice and the Looking Glass, to think about what it means to make responsible cultural comparisons. That when we're on our side of the looking glass, everything is square, everything is rational, everything is in its proper place. But as soon as we find the portal that takes us through to the other side, everything gets wobbly, everything gets wonky, everything gets slippery, pear-shaped. That the other side of the looking glass is something that we're unfamiliar with, and it's a challenge. It's a real challenge for us to try to make sense of it. How well have we done that? It's a great honor for me to be part of this, and John said it right, and that is that this conference so far has been all about the students. I've just the presentations have been extraordinary, and I've enjoyed it enormously. The establishment of the new Center for Ethics, with this leadership, is the beginning of something that's going to really distinguish UAA. So to be part of that has been a great honor for me. Borges is one of the great Argentinian authors. His career was kind of like my career. And so he says, around 1916, I decided to apply myself to the study of Oriental literatures. As I was reading with credulous enthusiasm the English translation of a certain Chinese philosopher, I came across this memorable passage. It matters little to a convict under a death sentence. If he has to walk on the edge of a precipice, he has already given up living. To that phrase, the translator had appended an asterisk and indicated that his interpretation of this passage was to be preferred to that of a rival sinologist who had translated the same thing as the servants destroy the works of art so as not to have to adjudicate on their merits and defects. At that point, I did not read any further. A mysterious skepticism had crept into my soul. This would be really funny if it weren't true. And so that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to worry about how we have understood what is really a continent. I always think that in Chinese you say 中国, but it really should be 中州. It should be that China is a Europe, it's an Africa. It's a continent that has all of the diversity that you would expect from almost a quarter of the world's population. So it's not a country, it's not a Canada, it's not a France. It is something much bigger than that. And I don't think that we have understood this world as well as we might. And that's okay if we're talking about the past. If we're talking about the future, if we're talking about the young people, then we've got to know this world a lot better than we do. So there's another ditty, a famous sinologist named Charles Dickens. And Dickens, in Pickwick Papers, wonderful passage. He talks about going up north to Scotland, and he has the occasion to meet with Mr. Potts. And Mr. Potts is the distinguished editor of the Eatanswill Gazette. And so they're sitting down after a meal with a glass of port, as they do. And Mr. Potts says to Mr. Pickwick, I expect that you've been following my series of articles in the Eatanswill Gazette. And Mr. Pickwick, rather embarrassed, says, well, actually, I've been out of town, I haven't received my copy. What have you been writing on? And so Mr. Potts says, well, I've been writing a series of articles on Chinese metaphysics. And Mr. Pickwick says, he says, that's a profound subject. Where are you getting your information? Where are you doing your research? And he says, well, I got the Encyclopedia Britannica and I crammed for it. And so Mr. Pickwick says, I have enormous respect for the Encyclopedia Britannica, but I wasn't aware that it had an entry on Chinese metaphysics. And so Mr. Potts grabs Mr. Pickwick's knee and squeezes it smugly. And he says, well, what we did is we looked up China under C and metaphysics under M, and we combined our information. That is the story of our interpretation of Chinese culture in a page. So what I want to talk about first is what Chinese culture is not, what Confucian culture is not. And really it has to do with the recent archaeological finds. Like if we were going to translate the Tao Te Ching, we've had in our meetings, we've had many students looking at the Tao Te Ching, the basic text of Taoism. A generation ago, we would be using a Song Dynasty manuscript, a manuscript that dates from about 1000 in the Common Era. But today, we have a text that was recovered from Changsha in central China, that dates to 300 BCE, 1,300 years earlier than a generation ago. I mean, think about Plato and Aristotle were leaving their footprints on the earth in that generation. Alexander the Great had just died when this text was put into a tomb. And so it's extraordinarily exciting. Together with my graduate students, these texts are written on bamboo strips. Together with my graduate students, we translate this text into English, and a year later, in a Chinese bookstore, a Chinese translation of an English translation appears in the Chinese bookstore. What is that about? That's a question for the question period. What is happening? And it's true of all of the translations that we've been doing, that within a year, there is a Chinese translation of the English translation of these classics. So these recent archaeological finds have given us an occasion to retranslate the classics. And these archaeological finds are really important. We're finding new text. Like in this particular archaeological dig, we found a document called the Taiyi Shengshui, which is the earliest piece of Chinese cosmology, of Taoist cosmology that we didn't have before. So there are exciting reasons to translate this stuff, but more important than even these archaeological finds is to think again as to how we understand this world. That the Chinese tradition was introduced into the Western Academy by well-intended Jesuit missionaries whose goal was whose happy goal was to introduce a universal religion to the Chinese for their benefit. And so what they did was they read the Chinese tradition in such a way that it was consistent with the Christian tradition. And so they would take a term like tian, which has a reference primarily to ancestors, to a sort of a numinous. It's a very unclear term in the Chinese classics, and translated as capital H, heaven. They would take a term like yi, which is the primary moral category in the tradition, and translate it as the word righteousness. When was the last time you used the word righteousness, Josephine? If you go to church, you're going to use that term. Righteousness has to do with comporting yourself according to the will of God. But in this tradition, we're going to discover that that's not a possibility in the Chinese tradition. Dao, translated as the way, with a capital W. With my student, Li, is translated as ritual. When was the last time you thought of your relationship with your grandmother as a ritual? Because that's what Li is all about. Filial piety, we have this term xiao, which we don't have in the English language. And so we, for the benefit of our students, we translate it as filial piety, and they're no better off than when we just say xiao, because they don't know what filial piety means. But we know that pious has to do with, again, with the relationship with a transcendent God. And so what we've effectively done is we have made this tradition into something that is familiar to us, but that really doesn't have very much to do with the Chinese tradition itself. And so we've spent these years trying to allow the tradition to speak for itself. That's what we've been trying to do, is we've been saying that if you're going to respect another person, you have to take that person on their own terms. You have to allow them to be who they are, and then you can establish a relationship. If you overwrite them with your own cultural importances, if you make them that is something familiar to you at the expense of their own uniqueness, this is disrespectful. And so what we have to do is we have to back up, and we have to try to think again about how we understand China and Chinese culture. Now, Tian Mu is one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, and when asked, how would you translate these terms? Chen Mu would say, you can't. That the Swiss linguist Saussure makes this wonderful distinction between langue and parole. Langue is the kind of vocabulary that every culture produces that captures the evolution of the way in which they lived in the world and the way in which they've organized the human experience. And this tradition has its own langue, and there are no terms in other languages that can speak that conceptual structure. In Hawaii, we have the Hawaiian people, and they have a conceptual structure that is defining of their life, over centuries, that reflects the importances, the way in which they interpret the human experience. And we don't have a language, we can't say the Hawaiian world in English, and we can't say it in German either. But Saussure says we have parole. And parole is the power of the natural language to say anything that we want. The Chinese tradition doesn't have a concept of a transcendent God. Marcel Grenet, probably the most well-respected sinologist, student of Chinese culture, a French student of Chinese culture of the 20th century, he says Chinese wisdom has no need for the idea of God. Okay, so we can talk. Let's talk about what that means. What are the implications of this? God is not a little term. It's not simply a religious term. It has to do with logic and philosophy. It has to do with the Constitution as being defining, capturing the principles on which we base a political order. It has to do with a set of moral principles that are defining of the human, what it means to be a good human being. So this idea of God is a big idea, and that doesn't have a place within this tradition. But if we want to speak Chinese, we can get really clear on what the Abrahamic people think about when they talk about God. Similarly, we can use the English language, and we can really figure out that this term "e" doesn't mean righteousness, because it starts with relationality. It doesn't have to do with comporting yourself to an external standard. It has to do with behaving in relationships in the optimally appropriate way. And so you'd want to translate it as something like optimal appropriateness in a relationship, as opposed to righteousness. It is not one, it's many. Each person that you have to deal with, you have to deal with in the most appropriate relationship, in the most appropriate way with respect to that particular person. And so being moral in this tradition is hard work. There's no following rules. There is seeking, using moral imagination to try to figure out what's the best way to grow this particular relationship. So what we have is we have cultural commensurability. It's not that these traditions are so different that we can't talk to each other. We can talk to each other really clearly, even though we want to respect the fact that they are importantly different. Another layer in the process of interpretation is what we call Orientalism, Dongfanghua, or Dongfangjuyi. But we are democratic, and so the Chinese must be Fu Manchu, despotic. We are rational, and so the Chinese must be mystical. We are progressive, and so they must be backward. We are enlightened, and so they must be occulted. We are individuals, rugged individuals, and therefore they must be collective. Oh, they all have black hair. We have the one true religion, therefore they must be pagan. This is another kind of attitude, constructing China as the antithesis of what the values that we represent. And this is not a successful way to do it. If we look at the Chinese tradition itself, the earliest writing in China, our oracle bones, taking us back to about 1200 BCE, discovered at the beginning of the 20th century, with a vocabulary of over 3,000 characters. Like an educated Chinese person can maybe use 4,000 characters, maybe recognize 3,500. So you have the Analects of Confucius, 1,200 characters. You know, that to have 3,000 characters means that this language at this time is already hugely developed. When we look at the oracle bones, when we look at the bamboo strips that we've been recently recovering, we discover that Tao, translated as the way, is not the way, the truth, and the life. It's not a way that stands independent of us. Alan, you were talking about this in your paper today. That what it is it's the human being. If you look at the character, it has the human eye. It has the human foot. That the way is our way. It's our narrative as human beings. That we are co-creators of the cosmos, along with the heavens and the earth. So the way is not something that is provided for us that we walk. The way is something that each generation has to address. We have to step up and be road builders for our own time and place. So it's a different concept. On the oracle, on the bamboo strips, it has the same crossroads, but it has the human being standing on those crossroads. That whatever the way is, it's our way. It's not a way that belongs to some kind of a transcendent, self-sufficient deity. We talk about the aseity of God, you know, that God is self-sufficient. He doesn't need Roger. Roger can't be God. God is independent of the world. That God is the source of culture. In this tradition, the source of culture are the cultural heroes, are the people who have come before, are the ancestors, not some kind of independent God. You have a one-world theory, not a two-world theory. The word Dao is coupled with the term De. So Dao De is the Chinese way of saying virtue or virtuosity. It's on the crossroad. It's on the crossroads again. It has the human eye, and it's the idea of walking straight ahead, being upright, being straightforward in your conduct. And so Dao De is the human being making the contribution to the human narrative by walking straight ahead in the way in which we pursue the business of our particular time. Now, a consequence of the way in which we've understood the Chinese tradition, I don't know that we have Barnes and Noble anymore. These bookstores have been disappearing. But if we were to go to the bookstore, John, and we would look for this Chinese stuff, the Book of Changes, or the Analects of Confucius, or the Tao Te Ching, we'd have to go by the philosophy section, and we'd have to find in the corner, somewhere between the tarot cards and the self-help books, something called Eastern religions. That we've been so successful interpreting this tradition as being something that is mystical, something that is difficult to understand, that we've located it in a corner in our, and if it were just the bookstore, but if we want to study Chinese philosophy in the academy, you go to Harvard and you're going to study it in an Asian studies department. You go to Stanford, the yearly, you're going to study it in a religion department. What philosophy departments teach Asian philosophy? UAA does. And it really has to do with responding to a problem that we've had. University of Hawai'i, we produce the PhDs in Chinese philosophy, Japanese, Buddhist philosophy, Islamic philosophy. The traditions, the self-understanding of the discipline of philosophy is that it's Anglo-European. It's white. It's philosophy is a discipline that belongs to a certain a part of humanity, when the word philosophy means the pursuit of wisdom. What tradition doesn't pursue wisdom? So, and it's worse. We're getting it's worse, and that is, Chen-Fang, if we go to Beida, to Peking University, and we want to get a degree, the most taught philosopher at Beida is not Confucius, it's Heidegger. If we go to Delhi and we want to study Indian philosophy, the most taught philosopher at Delhi is either Kant or Wittgenstein. If we wanted to get a degree at Harvard 20 years ago, if you went there and you said, I want to study John Dewey, the great American philosopher, William James, Charles Saunders Peirce, they would say, John Dewey, third-rate philosopher, you know, we don't do John Dewey. I think that they're still talking about him in education, you know, go to education. Now there's been a resurgence in America, that American philosophy is front and center. But up until very recently, indigenous philosophies have been marginalized and Anglo-European philosophy has been the story. And so how do we go about understanding this tradition? Well, think of an image. We got our Platonic lights on. We got the sun, the image of the sun. That as we get educated in terms of values and religious sensibilities and ethics and so on within a culture, the lights go on, and we walk through our narratives comfortably as human beings that don't stumble, that can see the path in front of us. When you have the lights on and you're looking through the window in the darkness of another culture, what do you see? It's light in here, it's pitch black out there. What do you see in the window? A moose? This is Anchorage. We saw one out the breakfast window the other day. What do you see when you look through into the darkness of another world? You see an image of yourself. You see the window has become a mirror, and the other world has become very familiar. We see Chinese going to a temple and doing something that we interpret as religious, and therefore they must have a transcendent God. So we make something that is not familiar by overriding it with our own importances. So how do we go about accessing this tradition? We can only do it through analogies. We have to find apposite analogies within our own culture, but we have to be very careful. If you do a Heideggerian reading of the Tao Te Ching, you betray three people. You betray Heidegger, you betray Lao Tzu, and you betray the reader of the book that you've introduced into the Western Academy. But Western philosophers can be borrowed in order to talk about this Chinese tradition. If we go to Aristotle, Aristotle talks about phronesis and the phronimos. He talks about practical wisdom. He talks about the uncodifiability of the way of the kind of rules that we have to follow in being a human being. He's really concerned. I mean, he uses the word equity not to mean equality, but after we've applied universal rules, we have to go back and we have to make sure that the particular people involved are being treated fairly. We have to consider their particularity. This is Aristotle's notion of equity. And so when it comes to practical wisdom, Aristotle has lots of conversation to have with Confucianism. We heard Shi Shan's paper on Aristotle and Xunzi. But when it comes to Aristotle's logic, I was the subject editor for the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, doing Chinese, Japanese, Korean philosophy. And the first line of Chinese philosophy is of Chinese logic is there ain't no such thing. You know, that logic is not an important element within the Chinese tradition. And so, if we look at logic, then Aristotle becomes a contrastive analogy as opposed to an associative analogy. The same thing and then we need retail and wholesale analogies. That Whitehead is just this extraordinary philosopher. What he does is he says that traditional Western theology has a concept of a perfect God, and then it has a concept of human creativity. But you can't put those two things together. Like if you take a perfect God and you have human creativity, then all the human being can do is replicate whatever is located within this concept of God. And so Whitehead challenges Western theology to find a different way of understanding God and a different way to understand human creativity, so that that human creativity makes sense. And so if we look at the Oxford English Dictionary, the entry for creativity comes into the Oxford English Dictionary in a 1971 supplement, and two of the references are to religion in the making, Whitehead's book on religion. And so, but yeah, as soon as we start talking about the primordial nature of God or eternal objects, these other elements within Whitehead, then that's got nothing to do with the Chinese tradition. And so when we use these analogies, we have to use them piecemeal, and we have to use them in a contrastive and an associative way. We have to be nuanced and sophisticated in the way in which we use our own tradition to think through the values, the experience of a tradition that we don't know. And so the upshot in the Analects of Confucius, there's this wonderful passage, gu gu gu, gu zai, gu zai, that this is a jaw-dropping, beautiful piece of Shang Dynasty bronze, and that is called a gu in Chinese. And what Confucius is saying is that a gu ritual vessel that is not a gu, a strange gu. This gu is in the Freer Gallery, and it is magnificent. I saw it. I used it for a cover of a book. Jaw-dropping, beautiful. I couldn't talk for 3 days after seeing this piece of art. But it's an artifact in that museum. If we return it to the life of the culture itself, to the Shang Dynasty, the person who owned this piece of art was a person who spoke to the ancestors on behalf of the people, was a person who had political influence, and was somebody who was economically a motor for the world in which he lived. So there's a difference between an artifact and an icon. An icon is something that lives in the culture. An artifact is something that is being taken out of the culture and is appreciated for its aesthetic beauty. And so what Confucius is saying is that the China that we've got has become an artifact. It's our artifact. It's our imaginaire of the Chinese tradition. It's not what China is. So that being the case, then we have to ask the question, what is this world that we call China? My recent work, I did a book a couple of years ago called Confucian Role Ethics, a Vocabulary. Ladies, we're going to talk about this tomorrow morning. We've come from Central Washington to put me on the spot. But what it is it's an attempt. It's Confucian Role Ethics, a Vocabulary. What we have done is we have theorized China according to our own concepts, our own way of thinking. We have used our vocabulary to frame a tradition that is not our own. And so what I do in this book is I go to the Chinese language itself, and I allow the tradition to speak for itself. What is Confucian ethics? Well, let's use the Chinese language to speak for itself. The second step, what I'm working on now, is a book on justice where you put the Chinese ethics into conversation with the Western traditions and have a conversation that's going to be beneficial to both. The Confucian tradition is not the answer. The Confucian tradition is part of the answer. It's the conversation, the social intelligence that is produced by cross-cultural conversation that is our best answer at any particular time. But when it comes to how the Confucian ethics have been understood within the Western Academy, up in our own world, and we've got our philosophers here, Stephanie, up until the 50s, Kant ruled. You had rule-based ethics was the story of the ethical discourse within our tradition. And so the Chinese scholars interpreting their own tradition, Western scholars interpreting their tradition, found Kant to be very useful in understanding the Chinese tradition. But then came along Anscombe with her very famous paper, Modern Moral Philosophy. And so what she does is she challenges the ethical discourse and says that we don't have an adequate philosophy of psychology, and we're using this kind of law, this rule-based idea to talk about morality, we have to have a more capacious, a more robust way of thinking about ethics. And so McIntyre and his After Virtue takes us in the direction of virtue. So now a lot of philosophers are talking of virtue ethics has become, and so all of a sudden the Chinese tradition becomes virtue ethics as opposed to deontic. So what's happening is we are using the Western tradition again and again to read the Chinese tradition. So the challenge is to take Chinese philosophy on its own term, to get past an interpretive asymmetry. We're quite ready to ask, is Mozi a utilitarian? Is Mozi act utilitarianism or agent utilitarianism? But we don't ask, is John Stuart Mill a Moist? We're ready to ask, is Confucius a Aristotelian, sort of rational virtue ethicist, or is he a kind of Humean sentimentalist ethicist? But we don't ask, is Aristotle or Hume a Confucian? So what we're doing is we're really going in one direction, understanding this world on our terms. So how do we get out of that? How do we get past it? The thing that we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to watch my time because the most enjoyable part of this kind of an event is for us to have a conversation. But it is this idea that grounding this Confucian tradition is a radically different conception of what it means to be a person. That we can take in Chinese medicine. We all have some knowledge of Chinese medicine, something very different from biomedicine. That if we take the concept of the heart-mind in Chinese medicine, if I were to take the heart-mind and deracinate it, take it out of its context, within 30 seconds it would be a dead piece of meat. And so the heart-mind, in the Chinese tradition, heart and mind are not separate. We do our thinking and feeling in the same place. Now there's an interesting idea, that thinking and feeling can't be separated. That makes some sense. So you do this in the same place. And so according to Chinese medicine, when the doctor feels my body, takes my pulse, the doctor is listening to the way in which the different organs of the body, there are 72 ways of interpreting this pulse, where what's happening with the stomach, what's happening between the lungs and the liver, that you're listening to these. If it's not too hot, if it's not too cold, if it's not obstructed, if it's not stagnant, then the body is working well, good. But the body doesn't start with the skin. That this body, this heart mind, won't function unless it has air. Won't function unless it has sunlight. It won't function unless it has the nutrients that are produced by the world. And so at the end of this day, this heart mind is a focus in a field that reaches out to the furthest ends of the cosmos. That you have a focus field. And so if you say, what is the heart mind in itself? That's not a question. That doesn't make any sense. That it doesn't have an in itself. It is constituted by the relationships that located in a place that enable it to function in an effective way. But the heart mind isn't just physiological. It's also psychological, sociological. How am I doing with my family? How am I doing with my old friend Diddy? That if everything is going good, if it's not too hot, not too cold, no stagnation, no obstruction, no stagnation, then the heart mind is working well socially, extending to the furthest cosmos. So we need a focus field way of thinking about person as opposed to marbles in a jar, spoons in a drawer. This kind of individualism that has become our default way of thinking about what it means to be a person. And so this idea of Confucian role ethics is holistic. It says that the human being can only be understood by starting at the furthest ends of the cosmos and then bringing it into focus. If you write to me At University of Hawaii, Roger Ames. Department of Philosophy, University of Hawaii. So you write to me at Beida, at Peking University, it's China, Peking, Haidian, Shaoyuan, Wuhaolo, Yaoshan Ling, Fangjian, Anlejia, you know. That in the Chinese, the address goes from the outside to the inside, where Roger is this focus in a field that extends to the furthest ends of the cosmos. Holistic, processual, that we're not human beings, we're human becomings. That as we cultivate our relationships, we emerge as distinctive human beings. That humanity is not something you begin with, it's something that you achieve. By virtue, not exclusive of your relationships, but by virtue of the quality of your relationships. It's fundamentally relational. It's gerundive. There was a book in the 1980s where somebody wrote a book called I Think I Am a Verb. But my book is I Think I'm a gerund. Like a gerund is a verbal noun. You know, it's where nouns and verbs cannot be separated. And that's what we're talking about with this concept of person in the Chinese tradition. And so the starting point is very simple in Confucian role ethics. And just to anybody wants the overheads, I know lots of students, if there's anything here, just send me the email and I'll send you a copy of the overhead. You know, you don't have to worry about too much about writing things down. Just send me an email and I'll send you this so that you all have it, you can look at it. But autonomy is a fiction. It's a fiction. In its own time, it was perhaps a benign fiction. Today it's become a pernicious fiction. And that's something that we might want to talk about. How has the idea of this individuality become a fiction? Association is a fact. Nothing does anything by itself. I see because I collaborate with the sun. I breathe because I collaborate with the air. I walk because I collaborate with the ground. Physiologically, it's collaborative. There's nothing that a human being does by his or herself in the world. We do things with each other. Life is transactional. It's a doing and an undergoing. That everything that you do is in the world. There's nothing that you do by yourself. If I ask this young lady, what does an acorn become? An oak tree. I ask this gentleman, what does a chicken egg become? A chicken. I'm here to tell you, you're wrong. That 1 in a million acorns becomes an oak tree. Most of them become squirrels. 1 in a million chicken eggs becomes a chicken. Most of them become breakfast. That we think in terms of, it's an idealism that we get from our Greek friends, you know, that the potential of something resides within it, and if we don't constrain it, it will actualize and become what that potential ought to be. In this world, potential, we can't talk about the potential of this young woman until the narrative is done. Where did she hang out? Did she find a great university? Did she find great people to spend her life with? And then at the end of it, through the transactions of her life, we can say, well, her potential, after we can add it up, and then if she did it really well, then it carries on beyond her life, that she's changed the world in an important way. You know? So potential is not something that's inside it, it has to do with the transactions that we undertake in the human experience. So if you just give me that, if you believe, if you say, I understand that life is all about association, then Confucian role ethics just follows from that, because roles are simply stipulating specific associations. One association is husband and wife. Another association is old friends. Another association is a parent and a child. Another association are colleagues in the department. You know, another association is a shopkeeper, and so on and so on. That roles are simply stipulated associations, but they become normative when we stipulate them. Are you a good teacher? Are you a good spouse? Are you a good computer? And so, in fact, and people who read the Chinese will know this immediately, that of course this idea of role ethic is translated into Chinese as 儒学, 角色伦理学. But you don't need the 角色, you don't need, what you're saying in Chinese is Confucian role ethics. Because the way in which ethics itself is translated into the Chinese tradition has lun. Lun means roles. So 伦理学 is the studying the normative, the study of the normative quality of the roles that we live. Is the way in which ethics is translated into the tradition. And it's also it's not simply descriptive; it's also prescriptive. So Lun, who was talking about categories? It was Robin Wong. Yeah, categories in this tradition have to do with, Lun is a category which tells you that categories are not defined in terms of self-same identical essences. We're all human beings. We all belong to the category of human beings because each one of us has the self-same identical characteristic of an immortal soul. I mean, one way of thinking, a familiar way of thinking. But in this tradition, we are human beings by virtue of the roles that we live as human beings, that the patterns of different families constitute an analogy that allow us to establish categories. So the idea of categories is defined in terms of relationships, not in terms of essences. So we got the fact of association and so on. And so what this tradition does is it gives us basically 4 things to think about. Number 1, that you have relationally constituted gerundive persons. One way of thinking about Roger is that Roger is this glorious, immortal soul that resides within this increasingly disappointing body. Another way of thinking about Roger is that Roger is Yoshi's husband, Bonnie's husband, that Roger is Austin's dad, that Roger is Diddy's old friend, that Roger is Gail's next door neighbor, and that I reside within these roles and relationships, and if I do them well, then I become distinctive as a human being. If I do them poorly, then I'm a shaoren, I'm a small person, I'm somebody who never grew. Okay? So the first is this relationally constituted person. The second, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, about achieving personal identity through our roles and through our bodies. The body is a hugely important element within this tradition. We're going to touch on that briefly. So, moral imagination, not reason, but reason as one element within the broader compass of moral imagination. That if we're going to discover what it means to achieve, to optimize, to find optimal appropriateness in our relationships, you have to see the actuality, and then you have to have the educated moral imagination that says these are the possibilities in this relationship. I'm going to pick this one, and I'm going to work at it. A kind of dramatic rehearsal. You're not simply making rational choices, you're using imagination to figure out how should I behave to this person that I care a great deal about. And then thirdly, or fourthly, an atheistic, human-centered religiousness. We take atheism as being the antithesis of religiousness, but the word religion, the Latin religare, means to bind tightly. Thank you, dear. One way of binding tightly is to bind tightly with my God. And that's very familiar with us, and that's very important to us, to have that way of thinking about being religious. But another way of being religious that is more important in this tradition is the idea that in family and in community we bind tightly. I remember asking my graduate students at Peking University, are Chinese a religious people? 中国人是不是一个新教的一个民族? I would ask them, and they would think, Taiping Tianguo, you know, that in the middle of the 19th century, we had a civil war. 600,000 Americans died on our battlefields. In China, at the same time, they had a civil war. 20 million people died, you know. And there was an aberrant Christianity that fueled the Taiping Rebellion, you know, and they almost conquered the Qing dynasty. You know, it was a huge movement in China. And so Taiping Tianguo, that wasn't a happy day in China. And then they think about Marxism, the opium of the people, Yapian. And then you think of science and superstition, you know, and then you know, the students say, no, 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 we're not religious, you know. But when 200 million, 300 million people get on the trains at New Year's to go home for day number 1, Qu-yi, Qu-er, Qu-san, Qu-shi, Qu-shi, you know, they have day after day that they go and renew their relationships with the community. That is a profoundly religious experience. That is reconnecting with your roots, with your value, with your place, and your people. You know, and then you go back and you spend another year doing whatever it is that you do. So it's a human-centered religiousness, not a God-centered religiousness, a different way of thinking about what it means to be religious. So you have this kind of a contrast between human beings, the deep roots of individualism. What is a human being? This was a perennial Greek question asked in Plato's Phaedo and Aristotle's De Anima. And perhaps the most persistent answer from the time of Pythagoras was an ontological one. The being of a human being is a permanent, ready-made, and self-sufficient soul. And know thyself, you know, amnesis, the signature exhortation of Socrates, is to know this soul. Each of us is a person, and from conception has the integrity of being a person. Very familiar way of thinking about what it means to be a person. Is there a viable alternative? Human becomings, from nouns to gerunds. In what way does a person become consummately human? This then was the perennial Confucian question, asked explicitly in all of the 4 books. And the answer from the time of Confucius was a moral, aesthetic, and ultimately religious one. One becomes human by cultivating those thick, intrinsic relations that constitute one's initial conditions and that locate the trajectory of one's life force within family, community, and cosmos. Cultivate your person, Xiu Shen, is a signature exhortation of the Confucian canons, a contrast between these two worlds. So, you know, and you know, John made this point yesterday, and it really needs to be emphasized, particularly for the younger people. And this is not a black and white kind of a contrast. That a relational conception of person is a possibility within the Western tradition, the Stoics, contemporary Western philosophy. You can never talk about the West. You know, that the 20th century in Western philosophy is an internal critique that goes in this direction, in a Chinese direction, so that your Heidegger and your Levinas and your Dewey and your George Herbert Mead and your Mark Johnson, contemporary people, are all thinking out, trying to think through the idea of a relationally constituted person. We live in an ecologically driven Western tradition, so the West and China is not a good contrast. But to make some generalizations, you have a notion of a soul versus this notion of ren. The term ren means person. 我是美国人. I'm an American. So ren means person, but here what it means is it means a virtuosic person. Like in English, we do that too. Like if I say to you, there are quarterbacks and there are quarterbacks. That makes sense, doesn't it? I'm talking about John Elway, or I'm talking about Brett Favre, or maybe not. You know, it goes back and forth. But we make, you know, she's a real person. You know, that you use the same word, but you introduce a kind of consummate status to the term. That's what's going on here. And if you see it, this person that is the number 2 constitutes this character. And so the way that you go from being an ordinary person to a consummate person is you work on the two-ness, on your relationality. A term that Confucius himself introduces. You know, we say Confucius is not somebody who is a philosopher in the sense of inventing a new way of looking at the world, but the one term that he does introduce is this notion of ren. And so the students are always asking him, what do you mean by ren? And each time he gives each student a different answer. Because what it means to be Ren has to do with who you are, what your aspirations are, what your proclivities are. So each student has to be responded to in a different way. It's not an acorn becoming an oak tree. It's each of us becoming uniquely who we are. So Ren is different for each of us, what it means to become consummate, given the conditions of our lives. And so one day, Confucius is holding court. And so he says to the first student, Zogong, when I say Ren, what do I mean? And Zogong says, Shi Ren Ai Ji, cause people to love themselves, to have self-esteem. And Confucius says, smart student. Student number 2, Zi Lu, when I say Ren, what do I mean? Zi Lu says, I Ren, love other people. Confucius says, better. This is really good. Then he says to Yan Hui, what do I mean when I say Ren? And Yan Hui says, Zi Ai, love yourself. Confucius says, graduate school. That to love yourself is not to love yourself exclusive of other people, but to love yourself in your relationships with other people. To pay attention to the relationships, to grow the relationships, to exercise yourself with respect to those relationships. So this term Ren, this for the students who are working on it, the term Ren is ambiguous. We don't know if you're talking about the inner person or the outer person, whether you're talking about the agent or conduct, whether you're talking about moral dispositions or the actions that follow from those. We make all of these kinds of distinctions, and they are not there with the concept of Ren, because we separate people from people and then people from their conduct. And that doesn't happen in this tradition. So this term means all of those things at the same time. I'm not going to spend time on that. So let me finish up with one of my former students, a student that I hate. I hate Peter. I hate him because I've always known that he is much smarter than I am. This guy is absolutely brilliant. If any of you are working on Buddhism, Buddhism in the Public Sphere, he's got a new book called Valuing Diversity, making the argument that variety is a whole bunch of different things, but diversity is an achievement when difference makes a difference. When we can eat different things, when we can enjoy each other because they're different from us, then we're achieving diversity in our world. So this guy is really brilliant. And this is when he's talking about Buddhism, it's the same. It's a Buddhism that is sinicized, that becomes confusing. He says, autonomous subjects and objects are finally only artifacts of abstraction. What we refer to as things, whether mountains, human beings, or complex phenomena like histories, are simply the experience result of having established relatively constant horizons of value or relevance as things. They are not, as common sense, or as this common sense, he should say, insists, natural occurring realities or things. Indeed, what we take to be objects existing independently of ourselves are in actuality simply a function of habitual patterns of relationships. This amounts to an ontological gestalt shift from taking independent and dependent actors to be first-order realities and relations among them as second-order, to seeing relationality as first-order or ultimate reality, and all individual actors as conventionally abstracted or derived from them. Very abstract. What he's saying is if you have a friendship, that the individuals are abstractions out of the friendship, and the friendship is what is concrete. The conjunctions, the transitions in a friendship are what is concrete, and the individuals are simply abstracted out of those ongoing, constantly changing relationships. That we're relational, vital relationality is our reality. That's what he's saying. I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure that we have lots of time for conversation. Before I do, let me just give you a preview of what you're missing. Putnam, the idea that mind and language penetrate so deeply into reality that there's no reality out there that is independent of us. We collaborate with the world in constituting a reality. This is our great Hilary Putnam. The Chinese does the same thing, except instead of using mind and language, they use body and roles and relationships. where body is written in several different ways in the tradition. One way is written with the skeleton, the bones, and so that has to do with the way in which we conceptualize, we theorize the world. Because we have bodies, because we're embodied, we structure the world a certain way. The second is the lived body, the Merleau-Ponty, the existential body. I'm in love, and then I try to figure out what does that mean, you know. So your body is also something that where you know something happens, and then you try to articulate it. And then there's the flesh body, the carnal body, where you develop an ear, you develop a palate, you learn to dance. You know, your body is an opportunity for you to achieve a kind of beauty in the world. The body is not something base. It is something that enables you to achieve an aesthetic in the world. Sing a song, you know. So there's the body. And then there's all of these different, they're the corollaries. What follows from the primacy of vital relationality, a radically different conception of a person. I'm going to stop there. Take some questions. Sure.
Hi, that was a really great lecture, thank you. I just wanted to make a quick comment. I was really laughing internally when you were talking about that anecdote in Barnes & Noble, where do we find the I Ching in the Eastern spirituality next to the tarot cards? And I thought, oh, it's very funny how we categorize them. And then I thought, well, what does the word category actually mean? I studied Greek at my university, so category comes from categoria, which comes from categoreo, which has two meanings, to categorize, but also to denounce, to look down on. I think that those two definitions kind of collapse into each other in the way that we categorize things. We try and understand them in our own ways, but at the same time, we can't help but say, well, it's not us, it's something different, something that we can't really understand, so it has to be shunted aside.
Very right. Like the idea, like in a Chinese world, you would never say your parent's name, because by naming has to do with control. Categorizing, if we can categorize, then we can control something. We know it, and knowing it is power. And so there's that kind of a linkage. Very nice, very nice. It's Aaron, is it?
Matthew.
Matthew, that's right. Yeah. Over here.
I'm wondering what happened to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and the idea that there's such significant differences between Chinese language and Anglo or the Western European languages, that they're really mutually intranslatable, and that if we really want to get a deeper understanding of the Chinese thought, we need to learn Chinese in order to do it.
Thanks, Bill. My translations of these classics are not directed at replacing one problematic vocabulary, one problematic formula with yet another problematic formula. That the Wittgenstein says that the limits of our language are the limits of our world. And so we were talking the other day about the virtues of learning foreign languages that are revealing of the way in which different people think and live. You know, that languages don't just say things, they sediment it into a language as a way of being in the world. And so my translations are directed at saying to the students of Chinese philosophy, it's time already. You know, if you want to get behind Descartes and read a Greek text, you better know what nous means, and phusis, and nomos, and aletheia, and so on. That there is a set of Greek vocabulary that are necessary in order for you to take Aristotle, to take Plato on their own terms. That's true in spades when it comes to the Chinese tradition. You can't, you know, if I say to my students, what does tian mean? They will say tian, you know, that you have to learn and so there's a glossary of terms at the beginning that tells the history of a term. Every time you see one of these philosophical vocabularies, it's Romanized and the Chinese character is there, that it's time already that we learn these terms. But also the idea of linguistic determinism is something we want to resist. And that's where parole comes in. There's no obstacle for us to having really good conversations with our Chinese colleagues, and not learning from them, but learning with them, learning from each other, and sharing a different way of being in the world, and maybe hanging on to our own, for people who have a transcendent conception of God, who have that kind of a religious basis. That's really important to them, and they're going to want to hang on to that, and that's fine. But to understand that there is a big piece of this world where people are religious in a different way, that's instructive. That teaches you something about how to interact and respect, different ways of thinking about something as important as our religious sensibilities. So languages prompt us to ask questions a certain way. They prompt us to see a world. By the time that you're 5 years old, the language speaks you as much as you speak the language. The language tells you how you should understand the world. So learning additional languages is something that we gotta really promote. That it opens up a different way. When you get on a plane and you go to a different place where you speak a different language, you have a soul change. You think and you live. You are responsive in an importantly different way. Very nice. Thanks, Bill.
Going back a little bit into what you were saying about logic and how that's kind of a foreign concept or an opposed concept on that. And then thinking again what you're talking about with abstraction and pluralism in meanings. I was kind of interested to hear what you have to say then about like the idea of like a coherent philosophy and how should we understand that then, and depending on how you answer that, I might have a follow-up.
Good. No, that's yeah. Sort of bouncing around in our seminar so far. Carrie, you were talking about it. Different people have been talking about the aesthetic. What is the relationship? Somebody was saying today about ethics and sort of a continuity between the ethical and the aesthetic and the religious, actually, in this Confucian tradition. Whitehead makes this distinction between an aesthetic order and a rationalized order. An aesthetic order says that if we want to explain you, then what we need to take into account everything that constitutes the cosmos. That you are there at the pleasure of everything else. And so that's the aesthetic, that the totality of the effect is entails everything that's part of it. Think about listening to a symphony. Is a note played well in a particular symphony? Well, the whole symphony has to be implicated within that note in order to make that kind of a judgment. And so this tradition is fundamentally aesthetic. You won't find the language of right and wrong, of good and evil in this tradition. You'll find the language of intensity. You'll find the language of beauty. You'll find the language of an aesthetic vocabulary that does the work of what we rationalize. Like if you begin from rules, then you're gonna see the world in a very different way. It's going to be measured. Some things are relevant and some things are not. Plato, emotions, your physicality have to be disciplined by a higher order, and so on. In this tradition, it's all relevant to the totality of the effect. The follow-up.
Oh, okay. You were right, there's a follow-up. I guess I get the impression that if we kind of lose a coherency when we get into that pluralism and that abstract, and then if we do that, is kind of what I'm hearing a little bit, in at least in a strict sense. How do we weigh things like fairness? I mean, a lot of those things are rooted in justice, and like cases are treated like, and that might even tie into autonomy. Like maybe that's a perspective of autonomy that. Because we want that because we're looking out from ourselves in some ways. And maybe you can speak a little bit to that as well.
Beautiful. The importance of principles and being moral. Should we speak to that? Is it Josephine? What's your name? Christy. Yeah. Chris. Yeah. principles that the principle of justice. We have to be fair, impartiality. It doesn't matter who people are, that we have to treat them all the same. Let me just ask you a question. It gives me a real opportunity to say something that I think is relevant to Alaska. And that is, who here would disagree with the idea that all children, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender, ought to have the same opportunity in schooling? Is there anybody here who's going to disagree with that? Only certain ethnicities can go to school. Only males or only females can go to school. Is that okay? So we sort of agree on a principle, and that is that all children should have equal opportunity to school. But I come from Hawaii. It's 1778, and Cook, around that same time here, he comes to Hawaii. And 1789, the first Chinese person shows up in Hawaii. 11 years after Cook, they're going to build a restaurant or something. I don't know what the Chinese were doing, but it's 1810, and Kamehameha the Great has unified the islands, and the kingdom of Hawaii has become real. When Cook arrived, the population of Hawaii was something like, we're not sure, maybe 800,000, 600,000 people. By the time that Kamehameha the Great unifies the island, the population is down to 145,000. Pauahi Bishop is this wonderful woman who is born in 1834, the granddaughter of Kamehameha the Great, and she lives a life. By the time she dies in 1883, the population of the Hawaiian people is down to 45,000. It's not that people have been killing them, but typhoid and measles and sexually transmitted diseases and so on is just wiping out this population. And so Pauahi has the prescience. She anticipates that the Hawaiian people are going to really take a beating. That she can see that 10 years later, the Hawaiian Islands are going to be overthrown. The kingdom's going to be overthrown, and 5 years later, it's going to be annexed by the United States. She can anticipate that in the 20th century, and if we go to Hawaii today, over 50% of the people in prisons are people whose self-understanding is that we're Hawaiian people. So in the year 2000, a court case is introduced by a powerful family, a Caucasian family in Hawaii, making the argument that the school that Pauahi established, in her will, she left a piece of money to establish the Kamehameha schools. And that schools for 100 years, more than 100 years, has educated the finest among the Hawaiian people, preserved the culture, preserved the language. In the year 2000, the Kamehameha schools was sued for giving privilege to the Hawaiian people. That this is inconsistent with the American Constitution, that we cannot consider ethnicity as a factor in allowing people into school. And it goes through the courts. Year 2009, it's sitting on the desk of the Supreme Court. Kamehameha Bishop Estate goes and pays these people $7 million, we're not sure how much, to get them to take it away. If that case was brought back to court, Kamehameha schools would lose their tax-exempt status and would be crippled. They wouldn't be able to function. Now, it's not just the Hawaiian people in Hawaii who think that the Kamehameha schools was a really great idea. We've had this renaissance in Hawaiian culture. We have 500 majors at the University of Hawaii who are studying Hawaiian culture. We have, it's the host culture that makes us really very special. And so most of the people that I know, I am sure that there's some people, but most of the people that I know think that were we to enforce that principle, that all young people should have equal access to education, that not only would not serve justice, but that would compound this injustice that the Hawaiian people have been served across the last couple of centuries. So principles are great, they're rules of thumb, but we need a much more capacious way of thinking about justice. Justice has to take into account, Aristotle knew that with his concept of equity, that we have to take particularity into account, that fairness cannot be achieved by simply enforcing abstract principles, anemic abstract principles against anemic abstract principles, anemic individuals. That won't get you justice.
Questions on this one?
More questions?
Especially on this side of the room?
Dr. Ames.
Oh, good.
Hi.
Okay.
Ryan. In terms of seeing the self in terms of relationships, I can see how that works within family or within maybe even the community that you live. But how about in terms of living in a nation, maybe as large as China or the United States, or even in our globalized world? How do we go about seeing ourselves as part of a global community when we don't necessarily have relationships with other people, yet we're somehow connected?
Very nice. And that's where, at the beginning of this, I really said that John, is offering us a corrective. That the kind of regulative ideals that Chris wants, when it comes to principles, and that we need if we're going to achieve coherence, social, political coherence in our world, then we need these bigger ideas. And that's absolutely true. If we're going to achieve coherence, socially, politically, we also need intimacy in our relationships. We have to respect family and friends and so on. We have to respect personal differences, ethnic differences. We have to celebrate these things. And if we're going to do that, then we have to find the proper balance between regulative ideals and intimacy. The Chinese haven't done that. Their intimacy, this kind of emphasis on intimacy, has led to rampant corruption in China. That corruption is the greatest problem that China is facing. Xi Jinping, the new president, is really trying to wrestle down this terrible corruption that is preventing China from moving effectively into the future. In America, we have a reliance upon law, procedural justice, where I think a couple of weeks ago we understood that 85 people in the world control half of the world's wealth. That the 1% in America in 1986 owned 8% of the wealth. Today they own 24%. Hockey stick exponential in terms of the fact procedures won't get you justice by themselves. If you follow the procedures, you need a social justice. You need for us to care about each other. Ryan, you take a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article number 1 to 21 is all about your entitlements as an individual. You're entitled to certain protections. You're entitled to rights and respect, and you're entitled to keep your own property. John Locke, all this kind of stuff. Great. Article 22 to 27 is all about you have to pay attention to me. I need to have a job. I need to have health care. I need to have it's incoherent. It's a contradiction. It's a contradiction because we don't put it together as we should. That you can't have all of your property and at the same time be a responsible citizen that has to pay attention to the well-being of other people in your community. And so there's these kinds of contradictions that we find in Aristotle, where he's trying to put, theoria and phronesis together. You can't do more and more phronesis and get to theoria. These are it's a problem. And the same kind of thing in our world, like universal principles, a real good idea, a constitution, abstract ideas, we need them. But we also need to pay attention to particularity. These two worlds need each other. These two worlds really have a conversation to if we're really looking for if we really want to do justice to justice, if we want a sufficiently capacious conception of justice, we have to have principle and particularity. We have to have regulative ideals and intimacy in the way in which we think about achieving justice. Steve?
The previous questioner sort of anticipated where I was going, which was looking at China today. What's happened to their understanding of the completeness of the universe and being part of the universe when we look at the smog in the big cities in China and the Three Gorges Dam? What's happening with it? Is it going to come back?
So, is China true to its own tradition? And I think the answer, Bonnie and I are going to spend the spring of next year at Peking University, and our biggest concern is the smog. You know, I mean that's and in China, the biggest concern is food. You know, to what extent has this exponential growth in the economy being at the expense of the safety of the food chain? You know, these kinds of issues. But I really do think that China is trying to think this through. That they say there's something like 3 out of 74 cities in China are below the danger level when it comes to air pollution. You know, I mean, it's a serious problem, and China hasn't lived up to this vocabulary. But don't forget, like I went to China in 1985. The tallest building was the Hepingda Fandian, you know, the Peace Hotel, 22 stories. Now, I said this the other day, you know, that now there's 1,500 skyscrapers, more than New York City. That this phenomenon called China has happened in a generation. And people don't know what is up and what is down. I teach at Wuhan University, and I ask the students, what do you think about your education? And they say, you know, that it's disappointing, that it doesn't live up to my expectations, you know, that, you know, you're at the best university, one of the best universities in the country, and you're dissatisfied with it. That there's lots of problems. The problems in China are monumental, and yet China's moving in the right direction. You know, that 400 million people have been lifted out of poverty over this generation. 400 million are still living on less than $2 a day. That in Shanghai, a woman entrepreneur wearing Paris fashion, sipping a latte, driving her Beamer is a very familiar sight. And yet there are land grabs by corrupt officials all over the place. China is a contradiction, you know, in the present world. But it's moving in the right direction, number one. Number two, as an academic, as a philosopher, I believe in ideas, and I believe that this impulse, this antique culture, this conception of person is alive and well in the tradition, and that it will turn the corner and take China in a better direction than it's achieved so far. But we have to be real. If we understand, then we have to be critical. You know, that's the point. Jerry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that. I just like to say, you know, while Eastern religion gets tucked away by the tarot cards and chicken soup with the soul, of course, the flip side of that is that if you go into the Barnes & Noble and you say, I want a book about ethics that's going to tell me how to live a flourishing, happy life, you're not sent to the Western philosophy section, right? You're sent to the chicken soup with the soul. And so I appreciate, one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is this sort of like,
the sort of way that you bring sort of like, you know, what some Westerners might call the kind of like the existential, ethical, and pragmatic imperative back to Western ethics, right? You know, and it's a way in which Western ethics can learn from Confucianism. When I think about, when I presented your work over the last, you know, few months to my students, concern that came up with them that I would hope that you could address would be, and I'll put it this way. when I see your work and your presentation of Confucianism, two fellow travelers from Western philosophy that immediately came to my mind, much less so than Whitehead or even Dewey, is contemporary feminism and Marx, particularly the young Marx, relationalist in the idea of self, strengthening relationships, and the early critiques of capitalism were based on that idea. Now, both the young Marx and contemporary feminists are people hoping to dramatically transform our society because, to maybe put it in Confucian terms, because they see that our society is structured in key ways in which relationships are badly impoverished. Relationships are based on a false atomization of the self. There is tremendous social dysfunction because of that. But in engaging in that change, or pushing for those reforms in those relationships, the word that would not come to mind would be harmony or harmonious, right? That for people who, and I think this is part of what's going on in Kristen's concern, right? That if we see that there are relationships that are in need of reform, how, from a Confucian perspective, does one proceed with those kind of reforms, given how core some of the relationships in question would be, husband to wife, right? How could you proceed transforming those relationships in a way, even if we don't want to talk in ideal justice anymore, in a way that is more healthy, that is more respectful, that is more enriched, that is more